welcome to RCA Radio, a podcast where we cover the latest news and challenges in regulatory, compliance, and quality assurances facing the life science industries. I'm your host, Brandon Miller. In this episode of RCA Radio, we'll be exploring what's happening in the medical device industry in 2022 and provide you with some insight on how to prepare yourself for these upcoming initiatives. Today, I'm joined by Syed Qureshi and Thor Rollins. Syed is RCA's Executive Vice President of Medical Devices, and Thor is Nelson Laboratories' Toxicology and Extractable and Leachables expert. Welcome, Syed and Thor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's great to have both of you here today. As I said before, the goal for this podcast is to highlight the major things happening in the medical device industry in 2022, such as the new technologies, use cases coming up, the new notified body regulations happening, upcoming on-site inspections happening again, and the supply chain issues. And there's so much more I know we want to cover today. So let's just jump right into it. So the new technology use cases, what's coming up in 2022 with this new technology and the shift to at-home diagnostics?
The trends towards home use is something that is encouraged by FDA in light of COVID. And obviously, when you have to use these devices at home by lay people, there is a lot more that the companies have to do in terms of safety and efficacy of the devices. Also, as we move forward and use more technology, device connectivity becomes a big part of these devices, hence the need for enhanced cybersecurity and device compatibility across these different devices, how they interoperate with each other. And there is also a big push towards using artificial intelligence, machine learning to do both diagnostics and therapeutics to make it a lot easier and more accurate with computer vision. Those are the sorts of stuff that are going on. We see a lot more software as a medical device for digital therapeutics and digital diagnostics that are coming in next year and the following years.
It's funny, so you mentioned that, and I agree. The interesting thing, the one thing I've learned in my career is the FDA does not like change when it comes to trying to understand how impactful something might be from what they're normally seeing. And so historically, we're looking at medical devices that are used in hospitals by trained personnel. Like you said, yes, they have their concerns, but usability and human factors, that's all kind of in the process, but looked at as a hospital trained nurse or trained physician. Now they're, like you said, they're having machine learning or AI trying to do this, or just a layperson at home who picks it up from a supply store. The burden to be able to prove that it's just not effective and it does what it's supposed to do, these human factors are considered differently. And we've seen devices that are like reused at, the concerns from the FDA are different now than they were before. Like, what if they're misused differently at home than they could have been in the hospital? What kind of risks could be there? And so I do think it brings a different level of concern. One, because the FDA has some unknown. It's new and they're not quite sure what's going to happen out there as far as safety and efficacy goes. But two, we're opening a whole nother realm of, can this software, like you talked about, security settings or others, have an impact that we just don't see. So it's going to be interesting when we see more and more of this come into the industry, what kind of a changes the FDA is going to have going forward.
So you mentioned the medical device as a software. I know there's some new draft guidances coming out. Would you guys care to elaborate on those new draft guidances?
Absolutely. So there's a new draft that just came out, and it's very consistent with the content of submission of software for pre-notification that FDA has published in the past. Now, there are a couple of new things in a sense that they have basically asked for what sorts of documentation you need to have depending on the risk of the device itself. And they also do require IEC 62304 declaration of conformity for these devices. And it is very consistent with what IEC 62304 safety classifications require. In case that, classes B and C would require not only design inputs, but also risk management and documentation for software, but unit testing, detailed design, those are the things that are not required for lower level risk devices, but higher risk devices, you would need to have more documentation for those. But at the end of the day, it's very consistent with the past guidance documents on software.
So you mentioned the medical devices software is changing. How is the FDA and EU tackling these changes in 2022?
FDA is just released a guidance document on voluntary e-Star program for electronic submission of the 510K, and also it is for de novo devices. It is not for the combination devices. And the way this whole thing works is that they do have some level of automations, and they have some templates and the templates are different for in vitro diagnostic devices versus non-in vitro diagnostic devices. And they're basically, what they're trying to do is make it a lot easier for how they review it and how they expect the documentation to be put in place. And it's about consistency. It's about having all of the different areas of the submission to be very specific. And they have built basically some level of automation in these PDF files that can also be automatically verified, but the method of submission still stays a physical, either a DVD or a USB device that you would also include with a cover letter that is a hard copy of what the submission is all about. So it's going to help in terms of, making it a lot easier for both the manufacturers and the FDA to review these submissions.
Yeah, I'm all for simplicity with the FDA. We're seeing, obviously, the industry's growing, and the FDA can't keep up with those growth rates. So they need to find ways to become more efficient. Maybe eventually they can move away from, a physical CD or physical USB. Eventually the technology will catch up, but this is a good step forward. This is similar to like the ASCA program that they're rolling out with the testing labs, which is they're trying to standardize the report formats and the protocols for certain tests. Right now it's in biocompatibility and electronic safety testing. They're looking to expand that, but I think their approach is good. They're looking at ways where they can simplify and also make it more consistent, the submission process, and this should allow for quicker and easier submission through the FDA, which is desperately needed. I know right now they're just talking to them and also getting a feeling from submissions how much work is on their shoulders, how much they're overburdened, and so trying to simplify it is the best for everybody. It helps us as an industry because we get more attention from these reviewers and experts, but it also helps them to get through more efficiently these submissions.
Just one more point to add. This is not that much different than the ECTD submissions on the pharmaceutical sides, except for they also have a portal that they could submit this, and that's basically both for FDA and EU. But now this is specifically for medical devices with a manual step at the very end, where the electronic submission basically gets done by either a DVD or a USB.
I've done plenty of my fair share of electronic submissions doing ECT publishing, so I know how much it streamlines the whole submission process and makes it just a simple standard that you can go into any submission and know where things are. And I'm really excited that things are moving forward in this direction. Moving forward, I know in vitro diagnostic regulations is fast approaching. The deadline is, I believe, in May. How can companies be prepared for this in vitro diagnostic regulation, IVDR, and what are some things you should look out for?
That's an excellent question. And recently, not long ago, the EU Commission recommended that the implementation be delayed due to the fact that there's a bottleneck for EU IVDR notified bodies. So what they have recommended is that all the low-risk devices, Class A's, Class B's of in vitro diagnostic devices that are not sterile, then IVDR is going to go into effect May 26th of next year, 2022. However, what they have recommended is for any sterile Class A or B, that would be pushed all the way out to 2027. For Class C's, which are medium risk in vitro diagnostic devices, it would get pushed to May of 2026. And then for Class C's, as I said, it's 2026, and Class D's, which are the highest risk devices, would be pushed out to May of 2025. And it's all about the fact that with the COVID interruption and the lack of having enough EU IVDR notified bodies, they felt it's necessary to push this out. But I know we had a similar issue and problem when EU MDR went into effect earlier this year, where all the devices that did not require notified body involvement, all the, on the EU MDR side, all the Class 1 devices that were general Class 1, that were not measuring, that were not sterile, that were not reusable surgical devices, a lot of people fail to bring those up and do their technical documentation for those. And this is one of the areas that people have to pay attention to, because for those low-risk devices that do not require notified bodies, still IVDR is going to go into effect May of next year.
So you mentioned it perfectly. I think the tendency for companies is to, especially the high-risk devices that are getting postponed, to go, okay, now we have time. But I wish people would learn their lessons from MDR, because like you said, the same thing happened with MDR. It was postponed. Companies then said, okay, we have time. But instead of taking that time and making sure that they were ready, doing their due diligence, looking through their files, making sure everything is up to date, they tended to, a lot of them just took the time and kind of went, okay, we have some time now to think about it. And then the new deadline snuck up on them. And even with the notified body bottleneck with MDR, even, we saw issues with submissions and people racing to get products or their submission through MDR so they could keep their products on the market. I'm hoping that companies learn from that experience with this in vitro diagnostic regulations. They use this time to actually get better prepared. And like you said, there are the low-risk devices that they're going to have to think about this more quickly. So hopefully we're not seeing the same thing that happened in MDR, where people look at this as a grace, like a vacation time, where they can think about it later, right? Let's make sure we're still working towards meeting these regulations, even in this gap.
Yeah, and another area is the UDAMED itself, the database that EU is putting in place. That is right now, the expectation is by May of next year, all 6 modules would be operational. Right now, the ACTA registration, the UDI device, and the certificates and notified bodies, which is a great area. In the past, it was hard to find out whether any of these companies had the certificate or not. They didn't have what we have with FDA in terms of the Access database. And now I think with the addition of that module, it's much, much easier to find out. And it prevents any sort of forgery, et cetera, for medical, especially Class 1 medical devices that do not have notified body involvement. But there are 3 modules that are left that are supposed to come on board by May of next year, which is the clinical investigation and performances studies. It's the vigilance and the post-market. It's when you have any sort of adverse event that gets reported up there. And also it's the market surveillance, where the basically competent authorities can share information across the different countries in the EU. But the commission basically decided that they're not going to enforce it until everything is in play. So that's another thing that is coming up next year, which definitely takes a lot of effort to be able to get there and be prepared for the UDAMED, and now that not only you have to register, not only that you have to have your UDI in place, et cetera, but also how you report the stuff, how you upload your information up in the UDAMED is going to be a big change compared to what we had under MDD.
Yeah, good point.
Next year is a big year for deadlines, and it's very important to start now because May is coming faster than you think.
It'll be here tomorrow.
Before you know it, it will be May, and we don't want people to be in the same situation they were in with EU MDR when things got pushed out. And moving on from that, I know that there's been some updated biocompatibility standards, and I know that there was a recent vote that US and Germany didn't vote for. So that obviously creates some issues. Could you guys explain those a little more?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So this happened with ISO 10993-1. For those of you that may not be aware, 10993-1 is kind of the umbrella document for biocompatibility. It kind of sets the standard for how to assess biocompatibility, and then the other standards within that series of standards goes into specific endpoints like sensitization or cytotoxicity. So -1 is a huge standard for most medical devices that contact either directly or indirectly the patients. And most medical devices have to go through that standard to get through their regulatory bodies. Well, -1 was updated in 2018, and it was a huge lift. Big changes happened. And in those changes, we went away from more of a checkbox approach and more of a risk-based approach, more of a risk-based scenario where you look at the device, its materials, its processes, and then understand what testing is necessary instead of checkboxing all the tests. It was a compromise, though. There are some regulatory bodies in the world, specifically FDA, that is a little slower to adopt, in vitro alternatives or justifications for safety versus the EU, for example, where they're more quickly to adopt these in vitro alternatives. So the new 2018 standard was kind of a compromise. Well, just a couple months ago, 3 or 4 months ago, a new draft was issued through the committee, and this new draft took more steps towards a risk-based approach, more steps towards reducing animal testing, and also started implementing more guidance within the individual specific biological endpoints, like implantation, for example. Because of these changes, and because we're in an area where in a time we're trying to meet and discuss these changes are difficult, it was a little bit of a hard acceptance of these measures for the FDA and for others. So when the vote came out, the United States and Germany both voted negative on the draft, but the rest of the countries who voted positive, which means it was accepted, even though, once again, because the US voted negative, it means the FDA doesn't really like this new draft. And that puts us in a difficult spot, even though the ISO is not an FDA document, right? It's an international standard that everyone's supposed to kind of try to follow. The FDA definitely is one of the regulatory agencies that don't have to recognize ISO standards, and they don't have to follow them. So if we have FDA in conflict with 10993-1, that's not great for the worldwide medical device industry, because getting the devices in here in the United States is a priority for most medical device companies. So we're meeting in January, the experts for that working group, to kind of go over this draft and talk about the issues that exist. And hopefully we can come back and have some kind of compromise where we can once again get recognition from the FDA. But it is something that's a hot topic right now within the biocompatibility industry. No one likes to have the main biocompatibility document not recognized by the FDA. That's not a position where we want to be in. So there's going to be some really good, interesting discussions coming up in January, and we'll definitely see where it goes. But that's one thing that's impacting us going forward potentially.
It'll be interesting to see what comes out of that meeting in January. It's going to really change the framework of how that entire ISO regulation is going to be seen worldwide. Moving forward with that, you mentioned the risk-based approach with the biocompatibility standard, and I know that notified bodies are using risk-based approaches to determine who they're going to visit for inspections. And hopefully, if pandemic actually slows down, we'll be able to do these in-person audits and inspections, which is the plan. Is there any insight you can give on ways to prepare? I know that FDA has been toying with the hybrid model of the audit where you do a little bit virtual, a little bit in person. Can you guys give us your insight to how you think this is going to turn out coming up in this next year?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I can tell you that us here at Nelson Labs, we were audited just a couple of weeks ago, right? So 2 in-person auditors. It was the first one since the pandemic. I've been on seminars, virtual seminars, where the FDA spoke and said they're going to start getting back to in-person audits, that this is a priority for them. And I know that especially these companies that started going virtually, there's a lot of the checks and balances over the last few years that may not have been up to date or followed. And so there's probably some skeletons in the closet that we need to look at before these auditors show up. So my personal opinion, I think EU, and I'd love to hear what Zaya says about EU, I think they're a little bit more postponed on when we see them in person. But I wouldn't be surprised if you could expect your FDA knock on your door January 1, right? Because like I said, at Nelson Labs, we just had ours. So they're starting to go in person and making it a priority now to get out and visit and audit. So I don't say, what do you think?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. Obviously, with the COVID and then the priority of where FDA basically put their resources, I've seen a lot of these companies that haven't been audited or inspected for a while. Typically it's all risk-based, and if you're class 2 and above, you get inspected once every 2 years. But now I've seen people that haven't been inspected for a couple of years. There is a little bit of a difference between what the EU and US does. FDA never put in formally, basically replaced the in-person inspections with the audits that they did. However, in EU, there is a formal mechanism. If you qualify, depending on what is the audit for, that they could do it virtually, and it's a little bit different from that perspective. But also, it's also coming up a little bit slower from that perspective. FDA, obviously, if it was a for-cause inspection, for example, if it put the public health at risk, they would go and do the inspections. But now we're going to be picking up more of these routine inspections that weren't being done just because of the what it took to do. I mean, they spent a ton of time, obviously, on the emergency use authorizations and making sure that everything else is in play, which was interesting because I have clients that basically requested for pre-submissions where they basically were told to, hold off, or, they rejected the pre-submission just because they had a lot of other things to do that had more priorities. But I think with the situation, moving forward, there will be a lot more in-person inspection. And there are things that, it's just tough to do, even with all the technology that we have to be able to do it remotely. So that's why, there's from, the inspectors are trained to read basically faces and then be able to ask questions and see how people react, etc. And that's a part of what they can discover. And then that's what makes their inspections very effective, that you're not going to be able to get that through virtual inspections.
Yeah, and you make a good point. We had a virtual inspection during COVID. And I have to tell you, having a virtual tour is not like having an FDA actually walk into a lab, in our case, talking to a technician or a study director. That's a totally different scenario and experience than having a little screen walking around the lab, right? Especially the things that they can see. It's much better audit, obviously, in person. And I know there's companies out there with limited resources when it comes to this, so my recommendation is that if you are worried about your audit readiness right now and you don't have the personnel to kind of do your own mock audit. I think you look for help, right? You bring in someone from the outside who has experience auditing, maybe an ex-FDA or something like that can come in and just really just do an audit for you and then have suggestions. Because I think for me, outside eyes, it's such a more important to be ready now than ever, because trying to deal with a warning letter or whatever it may come, 43s, it's not a good time to do that. So I would want to know that I'm ready with the auditor knocked on my door.
That is an excellent point, Thor, that, people get trained to get, ready for the audit. They have process and procedures in place, but there's nothing like actually going through the exercise and answering questions and being able to learn from those to be prepared when the actual FDA inspector shows up. It's about setting up your back room and the front room. It's about the communications. It's about, how long does it take to get something? Because even in appearance that it takes you so long to get something that they requested, basically, with today's technology and ability to get documentation, et cetera, is not going to reflect, good. It's an inspection. It's all about building credibility, building that what what is it that you do, et cetera. That is the key. And then being in person, I think it's just what gives them a lot more confidence and, reduces your chances of getting any sort of office indications or whether it's a 483 or anything beyond that.
Agreed.
Great thoughts. And moving forward to our last topic here, obviously this is hoping that things are moving back to normal, going back to those inspections and audits. But if things go back to normal, what do you think we can see with these supply chain issues that we're currently having? Do you think these are going to kind of go back to normal like the audits and inspections have? What's your timeline on this? What are you guys' thoughts? I know the industries across the board are experiencing these issues.
Yeah, because for example, if you were trying to go buy a car, right now, you're gonna run into the same issues or anything really. I just saw that cream cheese is if your holidays issues, cream cheese is on a risk of being supply chain issues. It's so interesting because we're talking like for me and my group, we talk to a lot of companies who are trying to validate and submit a brand new device. And when they're looking at a polymer that they want to make this device out of, but this polymer is on, back order, or they can't get it, or they can get a limited supply or a silicone or whatever it may be, but they use that same thing in production of their already on the market devices. Of course, they're gonna defer that to the devices that are making the money instead of the new validation project. So we're seeing lots of issues from even getting us devices to test, right? To be able to have enough material to do that. So the other thing I think is interesting is not just supply chain issues that we're seeing, it's also just expertise issues. We're seeing the shortage of experts in the industry to be able to help with these projects. Engineers or toxicologists, or even in the FDA, we're seeing those kind of things. So I think when it comes to supply and demand, we're seeing shortage of materials and the shortage of people being able to help. Labs, you see shortage in lab turnaround times right now. So I think all of this is impacting the industry. I do believe we're starting to go down on that curve. We're starting to see material be more available, personnel be more available. But once again, that's dependent on how the COVID goes and all the things like that. So if I could tell you where I see an end, man, I could be a lot richer than I am right now. So to be able to predict that, I don't know, but I do see us coming back. I see things being more available, at least in the medical device world, and capacity starting to become a little bit more open. That's just my thoughts. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, no, those are excellent points, and I agree completely. It's not only that you can't get devices out there to the marketplace just because people can't be on site working on the stuff that is required, but also, as you said, it impacts, if you have products in development, how you test it and how you do things. And it gets more complicated because, for example, if you're trying to ship to EU, you have work with your notified body with the timeline and schedule since they are, overloaded. And then if you can't get some parts to do the result of your verification, for example, or validation, you can't go and have them review your technical documentation. So it has this chain effect across that. How long will it take you to get your product out the door just because of those? So, but it is getting better. As the new variants come along, it's hard to predict how it, and we learn how to deal with it a lot better. But obviously, the shortages of the raw material, on components, etc., does have an impact both on already marketed devices and the devices that are in development. Absolutely, it'll have an impact, and hopefully, it'll get better as we learn how to deal with COVID much better.
It's interesting you say that because obviously the whole world's gone through what we're calling the Great Resignation, where we've seen a bunch of turnover in the industry. I'm interested to see what kind of impact that comes with training on the back end. I think we have, after COVID's kind of gone down, we're going to have a bunch of new people in new positions across this industry. And we may have lost a lot of expertise. So I think it's going to go from the Great Resignation to the Great Training. Like, are we going to be able to get these people to a point where we were before? So it might not even be supply issues. It might just be the availability of personnel to do the job correctly. We'll have to see what happens.
Say, coming from the consulting business, I know that it's harder and harder to find expert consultants every day. So when you can find a right group of experts, stick with them. I know we've gone a long time, and I want to thank you both for taking the times out of your day to go over what's going to be happening in the medical device industry in 2022 and providing us with those valuable insights for our listeners. And I want to thank our listeners for tuning into this episode of RCA Radio. Be sure to subscribe to be the first to know when we upload the next episode of RCA Radio. Thanks, and have a great day.